Public Accounts meeting. Pursuant to Standing Rule Article 108(3)(g), the committee is meeting today within the framework of its study on the Public Accounts of Canada 2022, which was sent to the committee on Thursday, the 27th of October 2022.
This is today from the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan. Nice to see you again. It's becoming a frequent occasion. It's and a nice one. The Auditor General of Canada, of course. Etienne Matt, Principal. Bonjour. Chantal Perrault, Principal. Hello. From the Department of Finance, Evelyn Dancy. Hello. Nice to see you. Assistant Deputy Minister, Economic Policy Branch, Nicholas Leswick. Good to see you again. Associate Deputy Minister. And then from Treasury Board Secretariat, Roch Huppé, Controller General of Canada. Good to see you again, sir. Manya Lae, Assistant Controller General, Finance Management Sector. Hello. Hello. And Diane Parasini, Executive Director, Government Accounting, Policy and Reporting. I understand I have opening statements from the Treasury Board as well as the Auditor General. Ms. Hogan, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our audit of the Government of Canada's consolidated financial statements for the 2021-2022 fiscal year. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. With me today are Chantal Perrault and Etienne Matt, who are financial audit principals. The government's financial statements are one of its key accountability documents. Our audit of these statements provides information that helps Parliament exercise its oversight of the government, promotes transparency, and encourages good financial management. Our audit of the government's financial statements is the largest audit conducted by my office and involves the work of most of our 250 financial auditors. You will find our audit opinion on the government's consolidated financial statements starting on page 54 of Volume 1 of the Public Accounts of Canada 2022. We found that you can rely on the information contained in the financial statements. In all material respects, the information is presented fairly and conforms with generally accepted accounting principles for the public sector. In other words, we issued a clean opinion. Again this year, our opinion includes an emphasis of matter paragraph. It highlights the significant impact of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic on certain amounts presented in the government's consolidated financial statements and related notes. Every year, we provide Parliament with a commentary report that highlights important information about the results of our federal financial audits. The commentary provides a summary of the government's spending in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on the government's financial statements. The commentary also gives an overview of the government's process for identifying overpayments or payments made to ineligible recipients of COVID-19 benefits and its process for estimating recoverable amounts. In December, we will provide a performance audit report to Parliament on specific COVID-19 benefit programs. That audit report will contain our findings about overpayments, amounts paid to ineligible individuals and businesses, and the government's collection efforts.
As in previous years, the commentary raises observations about pay, administration, and national defence's inventory. These are two recurring issues that we continue to monitor. For pay administration, we continue to note errors in salary transactions processed through the Phoenix Pay system. While the error rate has improved compared to prior years, the percentage of errors is still concerning. We also noted that the outstanding pay action requests involving overpayments totaled over $500 million, which the government is at risk of not being able to recover. This indicates that more efforts are needed to process requests in a timely manner. We have been reporting for nearly 2 decades on National Defence's difficulties in recording its inventory. While the Department has completed most of the commitments in its 10-year action plan, The commitment to implement a barcoding and scanning capability within its inventory management system is delayed. Thus, this means it will take longer before the inventory management is improved. The commentary also provides information about some emerging requirements that will affect our future financial audit work. Specifically, we highlight new requirements in legislation and government policies to report on environmental, social, and governance matters, as well as a new accounting standard for the government to record asset retirement obligations. Mr. Chair, I would like to thank the senior officials and staff of the many departments, agencies and Crown corporations that were involved in preparing the government's financial statements. We appreciate their ongoing collaboration. This concludes my opening remarks, and we would be pleased to answer the committee members' questions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan. And now, Mr. Huppé, you can now take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I am happy to have the opportunity to discuss the Public Accounts of Canada 2022 with you. And before I start, I would like to express that today I am speaking from the non-ceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And as you know, public accounts have the consolidated audited financial accounts for 2021-2022. This was the fiscal year that ended on the 31st of March 2022, as well as other non-audited financial information. I'm happy to underline that for the 24th consecutive year, the Auditor General has emitted a clean opinion, non-modified therefore, on these financial statements.
Community of the Government of Canada, the Department of Finance, and the Receiver General, and the Office of the Auditor General for helping prepare the public accounts. Let me now turn to some of the highlights in this year's documents. Total revenues in these public accounts amounted to $413.3 billion in 2022, which represents an increase of $96.8 billion or 30.6% from 2021. Total expenses amounted to $503.5 billion in 2022, which is down $140.7 billion or 21.8% from 2021. As expected, the pandemic continues to have a significant impact on the financial statements. The total impact of the key COVID-19 response measures on fiscal year 2022 is estimated at over $70 billion. These include the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy at $22.3 billion, the Canada Recovery Benefit, the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, and the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, totaling $16.5 billion. Also, the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy, totaling $3.7 billion. Monsieur le
Chairman, another point which tends to be raised and that I'd like to clarify is the moment when the public accounts are actually tabled. The Financial Administration Act requires that the President of the Treasury Board should table the public accounts when the Parliament is sitting and at the latest by the 31st of December. Even although the final date is set in the legislation, the actual date of tabling varies from one year to another within this period. For example, during fall election years, normally the tabling takes place closer to the end of the calendar year. There are other factors that also have an impact on the timetable. Once the Auditor General has approved the public accounts, we need several weeks to prepare these in order for them to be published. This also includes a version that comes out online, and according to legislation, it has to meet accessibility requirements.
Timing of tabling for this year was within typical timelines of mid to late October in a non-election year. I want to assure this committee that we are looking for ways to help boost our efficiency throughout the production process to achieve the optimal timeline for the tabling of the Public Accounts of Canada. Mr. Chair, I'd also like to acknowledge we are currently reviewing this committee's recent report on the 2021 public accounts In particular, we are assessing the committee's recommendation, including the one recommendation concerning tabling timelines. Mr. Chair, we are continuously looking for opportunities to improve how government operates, and this includes the modernization of the public accounts. Based on recommendations of this committee, the government committed to study potential improvements, and I am pleased to report that this work is underway. To identify possible streamlining opportunities, we reviewed the existing content of the public accounts to identify information that is available through other means not required by legislation, and some with thresholds that have not changed for decades. In addition, we have received feedback from the Library of Parliament on opportunities to improve the presentation and format of the public accounts of Canada. At the same time, we have engaged key stakeholders on additional potential improvements through a survey. The purpose of the survey is to better understand how the public accounts of Canada are being used and to gather feedback on opportunities to improve and modernize them. The feedback is critical to ensure that any changes to the public accounts provides information that is relevant, timely, and useful for accountability purposes. I would like to reiterate that any proposed changes will be carefully examined to ensure the government's financial information continues to support transparency and accountability to parliamentarians and Canadians.
As the project progresses, the government will continue to work in close collaboration with parliamentarians, stakeholders, and this committee. Chairman, thank you very much for your attention, and this is the end of my speech. Ready to take your questions. Thank you.
Organization and your response to our report on last year's public accounts. Turning now to the first round of questionings, I have Mr. McCauley, and I think in part Mr. Huppé might have preempted some of your questions, but over to you, sir. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Great. Sorry, thanks everyone for being here. I'm afraid I cannot be there in person today. A.J. Hogan, I just want to start with you on issues around transparency. This year's public accounts were 7 months after year-end. IMF guidelines is 6 months. What would it take for us to get to 6 months for tabling?
Oh, it's an excellent question that I know the Office of the Auditor General and my office are constantly discussing. Advancing the publication timelines for the public accounts. I think Mr. Huppé mentioned a few elements that impact that. I guess the statement I would make is that it needs to be a joint effort between both the auditors and the financial statement preparers so that we both become more efficient and effective, but it means deadlines all across the government need to move up or efficiencies need to be found in publications.
Barring an election year, is it doable to have September 30th?
I'm going to look to Mr. Huppé, and
Okay.
I believe it's doable if we both work hard at it. Yes.
Great. And then Mr. Huppé, then I'll just add, why did it take 5 weeks between the Auditor General finishing September 12th and it being finalized by the Receiver General, 35 days?
Yeah. So currently, we obviously have to produce the e-document that gets e-tabled, and we have to produce what we call an HTML, and really that is the 5 weeks that it takes right now to make every table, and we've got close to 2,000 tables fully accessible. So I will tell you that we've already started to work with some key stakeholders to trying to find efficiencies within that 5 weeks. That will be helpful for us to be able to bring that date back. But sadly, that's the time that takes.
Well, it seems an excessive amount of time, 35 days in this digital world. And then there's another 10 days before it actually got tabled in the House. So 45 days from finishing. Let me ask you, Mr. Huppé, just on the transparency bit, we still have not seen the departmental results. I consider them almost part and parcel of the public accounts. When will we actually see those?
I don't have an exact date for that, to be honest with you. That's not part of my office. What I could tell is that they're being worked on that right now.
Is it a political decision or a bureaucrat decision to release them?
Sorry?
Is it a political decision on when they're released?
It's a
Or
decision.
someone within
Well,
TPS?
I think there's multiple aspects to that. Obviously, they need to be ready, quality reviewed, et cetera, and gathered and produced. Like I said,
Which was
there's no
done probably 2
legislative
months.
requirement as to a date compared to the public accounts with a specific date to release those.
Yeah, that's interesting. Disappointing that we would fall back on, well, it's not required, as opposed to doing it automatically for transparency. I want to just switch topic over to, and I know we have a report coming out in a couple of weeks regarding CERB, CEWS, overpayment, payments for ineligibility. What is the government's exposure there for these overpayments, for the CEWS and other COVID payments?
Mr. McCauley, who's that directed at?
Mr. Hoope, if you have that. If not, AG Hogan or Finance.
I'll let Madame Hogan is actually in charge of that audit that will get tabled shortly. What I could tell you, if you would take a look in the public accounts right now, the registered receivables for overpayments as it relates to the support measures right now, you would see that there's 5.1 billion. That said, one make the point that that number is obviously not the final number. There's a lot of work being done by, more specifically, ESDC and CRA to
recouping
to get to
so
that.
It could be considerably lower, but could it be higher?
It could, yeah, I would say that it will be higher than 5.1 billion, to be honest with you.
Materially higher, or just a bit higher?
CRA and ESDC, yeah, CRA and ESDC are doing that work. Like I said, our job at the OCG is to prepare the books, and this year, based on the information that was out there, what needed to be recognized and was identified by these two organizations was 5.1 billion at the moment.
Okay. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have, please?
1 minute.
Great. I'm just going to stick on that subject. Perhaps you just give me your opinion on it. In the fall economic statement, there was a change on the payment for the worker benefit, Canada Worker Benefit, and they're forecasting 4 billion of write-offs for non-recouped prepayments. I'm just wondering, how is that a political decision to write off ineligible accounts in advance, as opposed to what we're doing with the CERB or CEWS of trying to recoup ineligible payments after the fact? And maybe AG Hogan, if you have an answer for that? Or if we've seen this before, where we're writing off ineligible accounts in advance and making provisions for it.
So in our financial commentary report, we did sort of provide a bit of an outline of the process that the government goes through in order to write off amounts that they believe are uncollectible. At first, they identify whether or not they believe it is collectible and set up an accounts receivable. And when collection efforts have been exhausted, then they would write off and show up in volume 3.
This is specifically writing it off in advance. They've put down $4 billion and committing to not recoup ineligible advance payments. Have we run into this before? Is this common? Does this require change in
I'm not sure, Mr. Chair, that I understand the question. I don't know how to properly answer it.
This is in the fall economic statement.
Mr. McCauley, I'll let you collect your thoughts there. I'm going to move on to our next questionnaire. It's Mr. Dong. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Speaker, and I want to thank the Auditor General and all your colleagues for coming today. The public accounts reported the deficit was $23.6 billion lower than forecast. They also showed a declining debt to GDP ratio. What does that say about the direction of the fiscal policy, in your opinion?
Well, I guess my thoughts on debt to GDP ratio is one that starts with understanding the calculation of debt. There are several ways that you can calculate the debt to GDP ratio. The government's financial statement discussion and analysis uses a few, which is the actual debt reverse, or there's also a calculation that looks at the International Monetary Fund one. So I guess it depends which one you're looking at in order to understand. The IMF calculation is one that levels Canada to other countries and allows you to compare them to other countries. And then there would be the straight debt to GDP or your equity ratio that you would normally look at when you analyze financial statements. So they both tell a slightly different story. So I guess I would go back to which element that you want to discuss about.
So on that, is the government's calculation or method of calculation consistent with those that IMF use to compare to other countries? Because you got to compare apple to apple, right?
Well, as I mentioned in the financial statement discussion and analysis, the government does do the IMF calculation. They actually give you a table and reconcile it, and that's to allow you to compare them to other countries. So it sort of levels the playing field amongst countries. Yeah.
Okay. In your commentary on the 21-22 financial audit, you stated that in all material respect, the government properly accounted for COVID-19 measures in its 21-22 consolidated financial statements. Could you explain all of the audit process that led to this finding?
It's quite an extensive audit process that we looked at when we looked at payments for all of the COVID relief benefits. I guess what I would say there is that money out the door represents an expenditure to the Government of Canada. And so all of the payments that flowed out are properly recorded as expenditures in the year in which they occurred. So that's the statement about it being properly reflected in the financial statements. Then when the government has assessed that some elements are potentially receivable, they set up that accounts receivable. So, the work that we did was to verify that payments went out the door. We looked at the estimation around the accounts receivable process, and we feel that the elements that are recorded as at March 31st are reasonable amounts and properly disclosed.
And how confident are you that the government spending was reported accurately?
We issued a clean opinion, which sends a message to everyone that we're confident the financial statements accurately reflect the financial transactions of the government and its financial health as at March 31st.
And does the Auditor General audit every part of the public accounts? And if not, I'll let you answer this question first.
So we do not audit every part of the public account. I think that's a fundamental aspect about an audit. An audit is not looking at every single dollar or every single transaction. We take a risk-based approach, and that risk can look at financial significance, a qualitative aspect related to risk. And we look at significant departments that account for large spending or represent heightened risks. We also independently audit many of the Crown corporations, not all of them, but many of them that are consolidated into the Government of Canada. So all of that work being put together is how we audit. So all of those are done on a following Canadian auditing standards.
So not every part of the public account. But do you think isn't it misleading to suggest that public accounts are complete once you issue your opinion?
Not at all. We gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence in order to base our conclusion and issue our opinion against. So if we felt that we had a concern, we would continue to audit until we were done. And so we've obtained sufficient coverage and are confident that the financial statements are fairly presented at March 2022.
Okay. How much time I have, Chair?
I'm going to give you an extra 30 seconds, a minute and a half.
Very quickly.
Sorry, you have 90 seconds in total.
Thank you. There are several large sums present in the public accounts regarding potential fraud and overpayment. What's being done to handle the fraud and recover the public funds?
I think the exact steps that are being done to recover fraudulent payments, you should ask to the Government of Canada. What we do during our audit is that an audit isn't designed to detect fraud, but when we suspect there might be some, we do special procedures and we adjust our audit procedures in order to not have them be the same every year so that they're unpredictable. And when we do find instances of fraud, we bring them up with management.
Is on the right track to recover those funds?
So most of that work will come out in the audit in December on the COVID relief programs. So out of an abundance of respect for parliamentary privilege, I would prefer to wait to have that discussion then. But when it comes to the audit of the financial statements for March 2022, we believe that any amounts that are unrecoverable have been accurately recorded.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Turning to, pardon, maintenant Madame Sinclair.
So now Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés, 6 minutes and 30 seconds for you. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm happy to see you all here. Let's put these volumes in context. We're talking about the public accounts 2022, and they don't necessarily represent a regular standard year. There was a pandemic year with extraordinary expenses and revenue. I think everyone can agree on that. During the pandemic, the Department of Finance showed leadership when it came to the different pandemic-related programs for businesses and individuals. They showed leadership on that. We can agree on that. However, I would like us to look more closely at the investments which are being translated as participation, which is not very good when we're talking about accounting. So that was for certain crown corporations, the investments. If we look, for example, in volume 1 of the public accounts, the investments of certain crown corporations, we can see quite quickly that the expenses have really exploded during the pandemic. For example, investments have really gone up for 17%, from 12 to almost 15 billion. And it's the same thing for the BDC. It's gone from 18 to 20 billion between 2021 and 2022. And the first figure related to the EDC. So I have a question for the Department of Finance, in fact. Who has decided that it would be the crown corporations that would administer these pandemic programs?
To be honest, as we're generating programs, and as you know, many of these programs were sector specific, regionally specific. Often we engage bilaterally with the financial crown corporation community, so BDC, EDC, to some extent CMHC as well, to ensure that where we were targeting, or the programs that we were standing up, were within the wheelhouse of their mandate, that we could leverage the financial authorities they had to deploy the programs, or supplement those authorities with new legislation and new authorities in order to deploy the programs. So for EDC in particular, like the Canada Emergency Business Account was something that we leaned on them to work directly to play that interlocutor function with financial institutions in order to leverage their expertise within the credit, financing and credit community to deploy that program. For BDC, sorry, I can stop there.
Ouais, mais j'ai juste une question de suivi.
Well, I've got a follow-up question on that. However, and here I'm coming back to the public accounts. For a simple citizen, it's impossible to get specific details on how this money has been spent. A simple citizen who post a pandemic wants to know what happened. For example, the number of businesses, the name of these businesses, where they're situated. It's impossible for a citizen to track all of that and get that detailed information because the crown corporations do not have the same accounting standards as departments. So my next question will be to the Auditor General. Madam, in your mandate, we understand that you're most useful and most agile when you look at these programs that often managed across various departments. And when it comes to pandemic programs, Do you not think, in your opinion, that it would be relevant to look at what happened, the Crown corporations, how they manage certain programs? Because simple citizens cannot do this if they're very interested in these figures. Well, as you know, we are auditors for several Crown corporations, and during our annual financial audits, we examine the expenses incurred by the Crown corporations in a given year. So if it's a program, then we're going to audit these expenses. If you're talking about a performance audit where we look at whether the program has been managed efficiently and effectively, then no, that's not something that we would do during a financial audit. But we could include a Crown corporation in a performance audit, as we've just done with chronic homelessness. We'd included a Crown corporation in that. Yes, that's true, that was included. So in this case, it could be relevant to see how a Crown corporation has proceeded via performance audit, or also to see what was the breakdown of the different businesses across the provinces and territories that benefited from certain programs, and to have more indicators, the size of the businesses, specific sectors, and get more information so that we can better manage a potential pandemic that we hope will not arise once again. And how much time do I have left? A minute. So let's now talk about the Canada Emergency Business Account. Just to remind people who are listening to us and the superb interpreters, this gives $40,000 to $15,000 to over 900,000 SMEs and non-profits. And there were over $49 billion that was loaned by the government through this program. And in fact, thousands of businesses in the last few weeks have been asked to reimburse all of this, including a possible fine by December 2023. And in fact, there was no interface with the population, so these businesses are finding it impossible to get answers on this, or to submit documents or have discussions, because there is no customer service within the EDC to deal with this type of mandate. So my next question then is, why did we confer this program to the EDC, the Canada Emergency Business Account? Well, it can be for the next round otherwise. I'm afraid it'll have to be an answer next time round.
The floor for 6 minutes, 30 seconds. If you're wondering why I've added 30 seconds, it's because I fell into Mr. McCauley's trance when he was talking, and I let the clock slip. So to even the playing field, I'm adding 30 seconds to everyone. So Mr. Desjardins, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being present. I'm sorry I'm not there with you, but I hope that our conversation today is not diminished by that. I want to begin by talking about, I think, something that perhaps the Auditor General and others could have guessed I was going to bring up. It's something that's been a reoccurring theme in many audits, in particular related to questions I've posed to the Treasury Board in the past on the Phoenix pay system. It's no question that disaster is affecting regular folks. It's affecting people in my community. It's affecting people right across the country. I want to share with my fellow committee members and with the witnesses here a story of someone named Tristan, a gentleman who works here in Edmonton and works for Parks Canada. He had began working for Parks Canada in 2015. Over that experience in 2016 and 2018, he found that he was underpaid $7 per hour. That's a massive amount of money to go without, in particular with the cost of living crisis we're happening now. He thought that it might have been fixed when he received a $3,000 payment one month. He thought that he was being recompensated for what had been a really terrible underfunding of his paycheck. What he received next, however, was a bill to reclaim that money. So he had thought for a while that perhaps the system had fixed itself, and he had found quickly that that wasn't the case. And now he was being asked to pay money back while also still sustaining the fact that he was being underpaid $7 an hour. This has real life consequences. This person, Tristan, is a real person, a member of PSAC, and has advocated within his rights as a worker to try to resolve this system on behalf of so many workers. This is a real issue affecting Canadians, and it affects them on regular decisions, like whether or not they're going to buy a house. Can I afford to buy a house? Can I have children? Can I get married? These are the questions Tristan is asking himself and his family members. And it breaks my heart to know that this is the case, not just for Tristan, but albeit thousands of people across the country. And so when I looked at the Auditor General's report, and I want to thank the Auditor General for her commentary, which is a supplement to the audit, which is supplement to the audited statements, in relation to her comments on the Phoenix pay system. It's true that the percentage of errors are concerning to the Auditor General and to me, and I do believe that there's a significant issue, and I point to evidence suggested in that supplement on point 35 and point 36 that demonstrates that there's a total increase in the amount of pay requests needing to be resolved. And so I'd like to first begin by asking representatives of the Treasury Board, Secretariat, some very important questions that I hope to get some good answers to, which is, one, is it acceptable that the level of outstanding pay requests are still continuing to rise 6 years after this Phoenix catastrophe began?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'd like by starting to say that I have extreme empathy for the people that have to deal with pay issues, to be honest with you. So again, not having the right pay is something that is major, and obviously we need to take the steps necessary to deal with it. Now, obviously, like the Auditor General noted, there are some improvements that was seen in a number of cases and stuff like that. That said, there's still so much work that needs to be done. So much work has already been done, and it is a definite priority of the government to continue to improve and make changes. And I
Mr. Hupé, what are some of those actions? Can you describe to me in concrete terms what some of those actions are?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So over the last few years, there's been obviously system modifications and adjustments to deal with the types of issues that were coming up. There's been analysis done on how to use our resources. There's been an increase in resources, but as an example, putting the more experienced now, and a lot of those pay advisors now are in a situation where they have gathered a lot of experience, are being put towards the more complex cases. And the ones that have a little bit less experiences, that are newer in their job, are being put to the less complex. So what we're trying to do is absolutely increase the efficiency of dealing with these cases. But like I said,
how much longer do you think the workers will have to wait?
I don't, sadly, I don't have that information for you, how much longer. What I could tell you is that the time frames in which we're trying to, PSPC, who is the responsible department that is dealing with the cases, is improving. So they have obviously timelines by which, when someone declares a pay issues, by which they try to resolve the cases. So we're meeting more and more those timelines, but we're not there yet. The aim is that 95% of the cases are dealt within the established time frames. And again, like I said, although we've seen some improvement there, definitely there's still ways to go.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have?
45 seconds.
I see. Well, maybe quickly we can get a response from the Auditor General, which made mention in the note that, quote, more efforts are needed, particularly to process requests that are remaining outstanding for several years. Ms. Hogan, how confident are you that this problem will actually be addressed, given the fact that we're still dealing with this years later? How do we build confidence for our public service?
I'm very confident since 2016 that Public Service and Procurement Canada is doing a lot to try and improve the situation. But there is a complex web of rules. I guess the one thing I would like to highlight is that there will always be pay action requests. I don't think anyone should expect that it would come down to zero, because some of those pay action requests are changing a bank account and moving to a new address. But those that address an individual being over or underpaid should be collected. Yes.
Yeah. And I'm afraid that's the time. We're going to our second round now. Mr. Cram, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I guess I would like to start by thanking you for all the work that you do on the Public Accounts of Canada and for, I'm sure it's not a trivial effort as we can all see. Ms. Hogan, I would particularly like to thank you for the opinions that you'd offered on page 54 to 56 of the reports. And on page 54, you focused quite a bit on deficits and COVID-19 expenses. Could you elaborate on why that was the focus of your opinions on page 54?
So the part of our independent auditor report that you're referring to is called an emphasis of matter paragraph. So it is at the discretion of an auditor to highlight elements that they believe the reader of the financial statements should be aware of. It is not saying that the amounts, it is saying that the amounts are properly disclosed and properly accounted for, but they're of such significance to the financial statements that we draw readers' attention to them. So we used that emphasis of matter paragraph for the first time last year, and we felt that it was still warranted this year given that expenditures were around $76 million related to COVID payments.
And are you expecting these COVID programs to be highlighted in next year's report, or have the pandemic programs been wound down enough and early enough in the fiscal year that they won't be a major factor in next year's budget?
Well, I think most people know that most of the support relief programs related to individuals have come to an end, and so I expect that the expenditure side will likely go down, but that the level of effort for us to audit the government's post-payment work and their assessment on what's receivable, their collections, will likely still be considerable. Whether or not it impacts our audit opinion will depend when we're doing the audit next year. We make that judgment call during and at the end of every audit.
In your opinion, is the deficit cyclical due to the COVID-19 expenditures, or are we in the situation now where we're facing a structural deficit for the Government of Canada?
I think that's a question better asked to, honestly, the government and the Department of Finance, what their projections and their plans are going forward. Typically, as the auditor, we opine on transactions that have happened and tell you the facts of what the end of the financial situation is at the end of the year.
Okay, fair enough. I would like to change gears a little bit and circle back to your opening statements where you talked about national defense's inventory. I found it a bit strange that that would even be an issue. So could you elaborate, like national defense, they don't know how many guns they have or how many grenades they have? Like what is the problem with national defense's inventory?
So it's been almost 2 decades that we have been raising these concerns with Parliament about national defense's difficulty at recording their inventory. And it's mostly in the last few years related to the quantities and the dollar values assigned to it. It is as a result of internal control weaknesses in how they record and enter these transactions. We do attend their inventory counts at the end of the year, and we can tell you that when we count items, as you mentioned, like guns or bullets and so on, they do an excellent job at tracking those. But National Defense's inventory has hundreds of thousands of different elements, and it is just giving us the comfort that the quantities and the dollar values assigned to them are accurate, and they're still working hard at that. And that's why that bar coding project that they intend to put into place, we believe, will significantly contribute to their ability to reduce errors in inventory.
And could you elaborate when it comes to quantities of items that seem to be problematic? Where are these blind spots? Like, what is it that they don't know whether they have or don't have?
Well, sometimes it's not that they don't know that they don't have it, it's that they can't tell you exactly the location. There's a lot of inventory items that move around. There's items on bases, there's items in big depots, and the controls at all of those locations might be different. And so, managing your inventory is a countrywide process that they need to get a handle on. And when we tested, we continue to find errors. I think it was about 15% of the items that we counted continue to have errors. So it's an improvement from last year, but it is still a large error rate.
That's not your time, Mr. Cram. I'll come back to you, though. Turning now to Ms. Shanahan, you have the floor for 5 minutes. The virtual floor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I too would like to thank the Auditor General for making herself available to this committee on such a regular basis, and to the Controller General, of course, too, and all other witnesses that are here with us today. And so interesting to hear the questions from my colleagues concerning the long-standing problems like the inventory problems, which is something that this committee has been concerned about and addressed regularly, but also the Auditor General, the kind of openness and candor in the Auditor General's remarks concerning, for example, the emphasis of matter, the fact that the COVID expenditures are extraordinary, because while we all know about COVID right now and it's very present to us, I just imagine 20 years from now, a public accounts committee looking at previous work historically and wondering, hey, what the heck happened during those years? And they'll certainly have that available. So on the tabling of the reports, I would like to ask, both the Controller General and the Auditor General about the tabling of the reports, because I do hear some concern from my colleagues that it should be sooner rather than later, and I think we all agree on that. Historically, especially outside of election years, what has been the date that the public accounts have been tabled? Would that be Monsieur Huppé who can best answer me, or the Auditor General?
Yeah, I could definitely start, and we'd be happy to share with the committee an exact list of the previous year's exact tabling dates. What I would tell you is that outside of an election year, obviously, you're looking at usually mid to end of October. Sometimes it'll go beginning of November, and we had years where we actually made late September, but the average is more around, I would say, the 20th of October within a normal year.
And in fact, Mr. Huppé, I do have some dates here. 2012, it was October 30th. In 2013, October 30th again. In 2014, October 29th. 2015, an election year, of course, so December 7th, and so on and so forth until, today's date of October 27th. Would you say that in any way in those years of 2012, 2013, 2014, when I believe there was a majority government, that there was any kind of holding back of the public accounts?
I could honestly tell you that I've been in this job for now 5 years. There's never been any holding back of the tabling of the public accounts. It's simply a matter of going through the steps, the quality assurance process. And like I said earlier, we are taking our discussion that we had at this committee last year extremely seriously. And if we've already, even before receiving your report on the 2021 public accounts, we had already initiated some steps to work with some key stakeholders to see how more efficient we could be. And the goal, I'll be honest, is trying to aim for earlier in October. So, as you stated in your latest report to us on the 2021, you're asking us to table by October 15th. We think, plausibly, if what we're trying to accomplish gets done, that we would be in a position to most likely, in a non-election year, meet that date.
Well, that's certainly good news for everyone here at this committee. But what I'm wondering too, and we did hear it earlier in your remarks regarding the types of information that are included in the public accounts, sort of it's a cumulative effect, right? Because I suppose every year or so, parliamentarians, we're a demanding lot. We want to have, information, like just exactly how many cell phones were issued, right, to the Defense Department or whatever. And I understand you're doing a survey now, and we certainly hope to see some streamlining. But what are the chances going forward that there'll actually be less requirement for information? In other words, the ability to streamline.
It's not necessarily, and that's a great question. It's not about necessarily having less reporting. It's actually that there's a lot of reporting happening at the same time and a lot of duplicate reporting. So there's a lot of information on different, departmental sites or other sites. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that we eliminate the duplication as much as possible. We're not trying to take away the transparency, but I think, you've kind of said it. At the same time, we're asking always for more, but at the same time, we're asking us to table and prepare the public accounts in a faster fashion. So again, right now we have about 2,500 pages. And, if I take a look, for example, at provincial public accounts, the average is about 450 pages. So again, we're trying to find that balance. And also, to be fair, for decades we had thresholds on what we report. For example, on ex gratia payment, we report on a line by line item everything that's above $100. Everything below that is grouped together. So, is this notion of $100 is not worth the same thing as decades ago. So again, the materiality of how we report things, that's the type of thing that we're trying to look at to gain efficiency at the same time, making sure that we're not going to lose any transparency, that information is available, remains available.
Thank you. That's the time I allowed for more time, because I was actually quite interested in the answer from the controller on that question, which I suspect will be coming back to this committee, I hope, for consideration before any final decisions are made. Turning now, maintenant, c'est encore Madame.
So now, Ms. Nathalie Sinclair-Desgagnés, you have 2 minutes 30. Yes, thank you. I'd just like to repeat my question. For the Department of Finance, why did you confer a $50 billion program to serve 900,000 businesses to a Crown corporation that does not normally do this type of loan and does not have any interface with the public and small businesses?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for that question.
Well, two things. One is there's no excuse for the poor client service experience that you're associated with, or your client or your interlocutor is talking about. That sounds terrible. EDC was a key partner with us at the very front edge of the crisis. And honestly speaking, just because they had the full waterfront of financial instruments available to them. They had expertise in guarantees, in insurance, in lending, in equity. They had plugged in relationships with financial institutions and credit unions, both federally and provincially regulated spaces. So we needed them at that point in time. So when we deployed the emergency business account, which was, really the big thing for small and medium-sized businesses, we relied on EDC. Now downstream, their client service performance and your request for better reporting, better identification of who got the loans, regionally, size of business, point completely taken. And I haven't looked at a CEBA performance report in a long time, and perhaps I should brush up on my understanding of that, but certainly noted.
Excellent. Thank you for your answer. So I'd like to continue with that. So in this case, would it not be relevant if we agree about the fact that everything related to performance and reporting of activities should be improved? Then could we ask the Crown Corporation to report this information in the same way as we have to report if we're a ministerial department? I think we've got a very good example with CEBA, but in general, in the future, if the CEBA can be useful, it would be to show that it is important to have transparency of Crown corporations. So I'm putting this question to you.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to go out on a limb here because I've been to this committee 3 or 4 times now and had a very common theme from the member, and I completely agree. Like these Crown financial organizations are massive federal enterprises that have a lot of capital and a lot of spending power. How we integrate them, but they are distinct beasts. They live in different corners of the Financial Administration Act, and they have different powers and authorities and governance structures. But I totally understand, the point here. I don't know that we consolidate them or integrate them, line for line in our public accounts. But whether their annual reporting and corporate planning processes aren't really meeting the needs of parliamentarians, and we don't really have a good understanding of what they're spending or how they're deploying capital, which is 100% taxpayer money. I take that point, absolutely.
Et voilà, encore une fois.
There you have it. Once again.
I find this discussion very interesting, so with your permission, I'll do that from time to time, not often. You're still all on the time clock, but thank you for that, those questions and the answers. Mr. Desjardins, you have the floor for 2 minutes, 30 seconds. And you're on mute, Mr. Desjardins.
There we go. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn to an area within the report containing information related to additional information on outcomes. And it was noted that there could be, in the instance, work related to environmental, social, and governance reporting. And of course, it's the mandate of this committee in many ways to look at outcomes and the processes of those outcomes to make sure that in fact, the public spending reaches those targets. And so in relation to environment, social, and governance reporting, I know that we, of course, have Commissioner DeMarco as on behalf of the environment, and I think his contributions to outcome studies are really important for the work of understanding how Canadians can expect results for their investments. In regards to social and governance reporting, it's important, I feel, to find meaningful ways to enhance our reporting to take into account those other aspects. To the Auditor General, I know you made mention of a part of this in your commentary. How could something like this, how could the government ensure that other aspects of reporting, including social and governance reporting, are relevant and complete and can contribute to a meaningful and holistic understanding of our reports?
So in our financial commentary report, I actually encouraged parliamentarians to ask that question to the government. I do believe that it is up to them to decide how they best want to do it. What we were highlighting is that international accounting standards are moving in that direction. I think just traditionally good governance, and any stakeholder is expecting an organization to discuss how they impact the environment, social aspects, and discuss their governance. So it is just a good corporate citizen approach. So I think that question to the honourable member should actually go to the government.
Comment from the Treasury Board?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And this is an area that is extremely important, and I have to say that on our radar quite a bit. So obviously there are some reporting that happens right now. If you think about environmental type reporting, we have the Greening Government Strategy and others. That said, there's a lot of work now that's going to get done on imposing potentially other standards that will come and affect what we report and how we report on this. So my team and myself and the Auditor General, actually, we both sit on the Public Sector Accounting Board and are privy to a lot of discussion about what could be coming down the pipe. So be reassured that we are following. As soon as obviously more information and standards get developed and imposed, we will adapt our reporting accordingly.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Time. Turning now to Mr. Genuis, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've been poring through these public accounts. It's one of the most comprehensive documents of government spending that I've worked with before. So there's a lot of interesting information in it. I wanted to jump to the issue of the Passport Canada revolving fund. I've been hearing a lot from constituents, concerns about passports, horrific failures in terms of service levels. So I was interested to see how the money was being spent in the area of passports. So this is on page 97 of volume 3. I was struck by a few things. Number one, if I'm reading this right, the numbers that are in brackets are still unaudited, which is most of the numbers. And number two, that in both 2021 and 2022, the actual spending was way over the amount contained in the estimates, more than double in 2021, and still $100 million more in 2022. What's going on here? Maybe Auditor General first, and then Department of Finance. what's behind these seeming oddities that I'm identifying here?
So, Mr. Chair, as the member pointed out, that area is unaudited, and so I think the question is best asked to the Controller General's office.
I have to admit that I will have to take that question back and give an answer around the variance analysis for that one. That's my team. No, I don't have that offhand.
I think
Okay,
you might get that question again on Tuesday. So good.
Okay,
so you don't a little homework.
I figured that.
You don't have an answer. Okay, so if we can get an answer though in writing ahead of Tuesday, because I'd like to be able to get an initial sense of what went wrong, and then be able to follow up. Again, expecting that we see audited information, and especially in an area that's been so sensitive and such an issue of concern for Canadians. I also just noted in terms of the expenses of the Passport Canada revolving fund that there's actually a decrease from 2021 to 2022 in the amount we're spending on salaries and employee benefits. I would have assumed that there would have been a significant increase in demand for services. Are we cutting back the number of people working for Passport Canada? Is that part of the explanation behind the service problems? It was 101 million in 2021, 94.5 million in 2022. Again, why is it that we're spending less on salaries and employees at Passport Canada between these 2 years?
Again, I'll have to, if you allow me, I'll take that back and have the details around why the decrease.
Just
okay.
I think if we put ourselves in the context of the 2022 year, I mean, you're like so this is the 21-22 public accounts, right? So over the course of 2021, nobody was really traveling a whole lot. And then into 2022, you had the whole Omicron episode at the very front edge of 2022. So I assume there wasn't a whole lot of business going on in Passport Canada office, right? And then Omicron passed and the whole world reopened and you flipped the switch, and I think that's where the chaos started. So,
but I'm comparing the 2020-2021 numbers to the 2021-2022 numbers, and 2020 from 2020 to 2021. Of course, that's well into the pandemic in terms of the fiscal year. And then we have, I would assume, more people making passport applications in 2022. That's certainly the sense that we got in our constituency office, and yet we're spending less. So I don't know if you have an answer for that or just speculation, but the speculation doesn't seem to line up with what was happening.
But the 2020, this cut off on March 31st, 2022, right? So you kind of
right, but I think there was still more traveling going on balance in that period than there was in the previous period, because I'm comparing it to the fiscal year that ended in 2021, which would have taken us from essentially the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody stopped traveling and nobody had any idea what was going on, for the year after that. So, but I also just wanted to mention before my time runs out that there was a big increase in professional and special services. So there was an actually substantial increase in overall spending, but less spent on employees and more spent on professional and special services. And again, the result of that seems to have been, especially as we've seen coming into this fiscal year, poor outcomes. So any explanation as to the big hike in professional and special services alongside the cut in spending on regular employees?
And Mr. Generous, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave that hanging for now.
Yeah,
either come back to it, or I suspect the control is going
to
have some answers for us very soon. But appreciate the questions. Turn now to Mr. Fragaskatos. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. My questions will go to Finance. I'm looking at page 41 of Volume 1, Table 1.1. Under line item Employment Insurance Premiums, the amount for 2022 appears to me to be quite healthy. Based on everything that the IMF has said about a potential slowdown in the global economy, based also on what the World Bank has said on that same issue. I'd like Finance's view on where we're at in terms of the amount for EI, and whether or not we are well positioned to weather a storm a recession storm potentially if that does come.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I don't know if I totally understand the question, whether the EI program is fit for purpose for the next recession?
Are EI premiums under revenues?
Yeah, I see that.
Is that a strong number based on what the IMF has said, in particular about a potential slowdown in the global economy? If we have Canadian workers that are let go, are we well positioned as a country to respond to their needs?
I mean, thank you for the question. I mean, the EI insurance premium line reflects premiums paid by employers and employees on payroll deductions. So the 24 billion, approximately 24 billion, just reflects that income drawn into the EI account, which is consolidated with larger consolidated revenues. Is the EI account well positioned? I mean, the EI account is in deficit right now. So, I mean, in that context, I would potentially question whether it's well positioned. On the other hand, the employment insurance program itself, I think we've shown has shown some resilience and has been fit for purpose over the course of the last number of recessions. It seems to be very adaptable and flexible to economic conditions. It's dynamic to different parts of the country, and it provides an appropriate replacement rate for workers who have temporary layoffs. So I'm confident in that, but in terms of the financing of the account, I mean, it's been a rough road over the last 2 years, quite frankly, and we need to to rebase our position in the account.
Okay, I want to, and Mr. Dong already brought up a debt to GDP ratio, but we didn't get into there wasn't enough time, obviously, but I'd like more information on how Canada compares to like countries. The G7, for example, partners that we have. Where are we in terms of our debt to GDP ratio compared to those members?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I mean, we have a chart on that, and we do very well. I mean, we're a G7 leader in terms of our debt in relation to the overall size of our economy. So someone's going to beat me to the chart. On page 35, you can see the illustration of that.
Okay, and on debt to GDP ratio as a measure, obviously there's many ways to tabulate a country's debt. Why? Because we often hear the government making reference to debt to GDP ratio, and I think there's very good reason for that. But I think it's important to put on the record why debt to GDP ratio is the go-to, so to speak, for the Government of Canada. Maybe you can add something about the IMF in terms of your interactions with the organization. They seem to take it very seriously as well. But why that particular measure as opposed to others? What does it add that others don't?
Right. Again, and thank you for the question. I mean, it is a good reflection of the a country's ability to repay its debt, to service its debt in relation to the size of its economy. So, I mean, full stop on that. And I think there's consensus that it's a good metric in terms of overall debt sustainability over the near term and over the longer term from a fiscal sustainability perspective. But I do acknowledge there are some pitfalls and caveats when you start to do this stuff over comparing between countries, and I think we've touched on that at this committee before, because every country is different. I mean, you have sovereign, the highest sovereign level of governments, and you have provinces and sub-sovereign levels. So in order for the IMF to establish this level of comparability, they have to do a lot of different puts and takes. And so we do this reconciliation on page 35, just to be very clear and transparent in terms of how we go from a federal debt to GDP ratio, which is the kind of target that the government talks to in terms of how it wants to achieve a certain target in its budgets or update, versus the Canada's net debt to GDP ratio, which is what is compared to across countries. And so that reconciliation is showed on page 36.
I don't think I have much time to get into page 36, but I will with
We can come back to you, though, because you are out of time.
Indeed, there we go.
And again,
Thank you, Chair.
It must be a Friday afternoon. I'm a little slipping on the timer here, but these are good exchanges. Mr. McCauley, you have the floor again for 5 minutes, and I'm going to be alert and watching the clock this time. And you're on mute, sir.
Yeah, I'm just having some microphone problems. Thanks, witnesses. I want to get to the carbon tax or the incentive payments. For the backstop provinces, what is the actual dollar in and out? Because I understand we changed perhaps how we're accounting for it because it's being paid quarterly now. And how much of the carbon tax for the backstop provinces was used for federal programming as opposed to rebating direct as refunds to taxpayers, please?
Is that to finance the controller?
Sorry, again, I'm having problems with
Sorry,
the mic.
Mr. McCauley,
finance, whoever's
finance,
got an answer. Whoever has an answer.
Sorry for the pause there, Mr. McCauley. Appreciate the question. And sorry, I don't mean to cut your time. Your question was?
I think it's on page 41. He's asking just the kind of discrepancy.
Yeah, last year it was on page 17 of volume 1. There was a very clear note of, I think it was $98 million was used for other federal programming. There was no such clear notification this year's volume 1 public accounts. So the backstop provinces, how much of the carbon tax collected, or however you wish to term that, money collected, went to federal program spending as opposed to direct rebates to taxpayers?
That's a very direct question. I'll have to get back in writing because I don't have the answer at my fingertips, but I do understand the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Does AG Hogan, do we know why we have not separated it out in the public accounts as we did last year?
Again, I think that's a question best asked to the Controller General's office. My guess would be it was not a very material amount, but I would have to encourage you to ask them.
Would you answer that then for me, please?
That was last year on page, that was in the FSDNA, I think, last year, if I'm not mistaken. So
that was volume 1. It was page 17 or page 18. It was very specific, noting where $98 million of, which is in the grand scheme of things, and $1 trillion debt is not big, but 98 million is a substantial amount of money. It stated very clearly that the backstop money went to federal programming as opposed to a direct rebate. This year, there's no mention of that. So I'm just curious how much went.
Again, I appreciate the question.
Or why it did not. Sorry, and why it was not broken out on this public accounts. I'll just move on. Maybe you can get back to us on that. How much was the Bank of Canada losses in last year? We see in the fall economic statement, it's about, I think, $5 to $6 billion this year. What was it last year? And do we have a forecast what it will be for this year?
The losses for last year, I don't believe there were any losses last year. But for this year, we're estimating in and around, I think, about $1 billion in losses.
Oh, just $1 billion. Would you be able to get back to us on a more precise number? Because I understood it was to be higher.
Absolutely, we'll get back to you. The number perhaps you're thinking of is something accumulated over a longer time horizon, but to the member, I think just for this year, the 22-23 year, so the year ending this March 31st, 2023, we're in around $1 billion.
Okay. There's line item. I'm afraid I don't have the page for you, but it's about government allowance for doubtful accounts of $21.5 billion, up from $18.9 billion last year, including bad debt provisions of $5.4 billion for GST, up from $3.8 billion last year. Are you able to let us know what is driving such an increase? And I apologize, I don't have the page number for you.
Yeah. So, generally speaking, we've seen an increase in the receivable also, so tax receivables, for example. So again, the allowances the allowances would most likely also increase by that same token. But we could give you, we'll try to find the exact reference to the 21 billion, Mr. Chair, and we can certainly come back with a detailed variance analysis from the 18 billion last year.
Yeah, because it does give a breakdown of individual employer corporations, but this jump really
Thank you,
stands
Mr.
out.
McCauley.
Is this-
Thank you, Mr. McCauley. The Controller will get back to us on that. The time has elapsed. And I'll just draw your attention as well, Controller, to on page 16 for 2022, the government recorded a net losses totaling $1 billion. Then in brackets is $19 billion in 2021 in respect to the bank's purchase of Government of Canada bonds. So maybe an explanation on that next time would be helpful as well. Thank you. And turning now to MP Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but it's a pretty impressive lineup there across the foot of the room. So thank you for your very important work and for reporting so diligently to this committee. So for my first question, I'll address to Ms. Dancy, since she hasn't had one yet, and if it's not her, someone else can step in. How did the enterprise Crown corporations rebound from a deficit of 10.5 in 2021 to exceeding 2022 budget expectations to go to 12.8?
Well, thank you for the question, and I probably will cede the floor to people who may have more precision, but I can offer kind of as a first level response. Of course, Crown corporations were involved in the delivery of COVID programming to some extent, and that is trickling through its financials, and their circumstances are improving over time as a result of that. Enterprise Crown corporations that are active in financial markets, delivering financial services, also are benefiting in terms of their performance along with the economic recovery, the broader economic recovery. Sort of looking ahead, we also talked in the fall economic statement about improvements that would arise as well from interest-bearing activities of the enterprise Crown corporations as well as the government in a rising interest rate environment. And if anyone else would wish to add, but you're welcome to.
So revenue type programs and is there opportunity for even more growth of those types of programs going forward? If anyone could jump into that. Specific programs that contributed to this improvement in the situation, and is there potential for further growth going forward?
Maybe I'll step out on a limb here and I'll have my colleagues correct me, but to your first question, of the member, I think part of the explanation is the previous member mentioned the loss of Bank of Canada of $19 billion last year. So again, that loss not being there, obviously, this year in 2022 had an impact on the variance of the results of the Crown Corporation also.
I was just wondering if you could comment on the net foreign exchange revenues. In 2021, it was 2.1 million and for 2022, it dropped to 873. Could you explain why there was such a substantial drop?
I can take that one. There was a decrease of about $1.1 billion related to net gains on sales of marketable securities, largely because of changing interest rates and the fair value of bonds moving in opposite directions. Plus another $160 million on interest on cash equivalents, and marketable securities. So it's all just related to market impacts over the course of the past year.
Okay. Now, looking at actuarial losses, Ms. Hogan, could you explain what do net actuarial losses mean, first of all?
So I'm not a pension expert, but I will do my best. Really, it is the accumulation of, so let me back up, that pension liabilities are a very complex and long-term liability. And in order to determine the value today, and in this case at March 31st, of this very long-term liability, actuarials get involved. actuaries get involved, and they include a whole bunch of assumptions about demographics, about how long people will live, about the economy, about inflation. There's tons of inputs, and every year that fluctuates. And as those fluctuations happen, those are the actuarial gains and losses that are reflected in the liability. They are then under public sector accounting standards, deferred and sort of amortized over time into the accounts. It is just a way of sort of present valuing the long-term liability into today's dollars.
So how does that impact the annual deficit?
Well, in any given year, it's a portion, right? Because the actuarial gains and losses are amortized over time into the deficit. So it's an increase of the deficit over time when it's a loss.
It's a sliding scale, I think, and that is the time. Tournant maintenant à Madame Sinclair.
And now, Ms. Sinclair de Gagné for 2 minutes 30. Thank you, Chair. Well, it seems we have reached some consensus about the increased need to have transparency and accountability of Crown corporations, and I'm happy to hear that. I have a question for the Treasury Board. Mr. Upi, in your comment, or rather in the comments on the financial audits for 2020-2021, the Auditor General noted that 31 out of the 34 plans of the Crown corporations had not been approved by the Treasury Board before the start of each fiscal year for each corporation. How is that possible? The Crown corporations have a business plan, which I think is for a 3-year period, and then each year they are meant to come back and get the new plan approved, the new 3-year plan approved by the Treasury Board. Having said that, if it's not done, their previous plan for 3 years remains in effect until they come back to the Treasury Board for approval. So unfortunately, you're quite right. There are situations that have occurred where the new plans have not been represented or submitted within the correct deadlines. Do you do any follow-up on that? Are there constant communications with Crown corporations so that they can come out with a plan per year? I don't think that's an exaggerated ask. I don't know exactly what type of follow-up happens, but it's true that some of my colleagues in the Treasury Board have the responsibility of looking at this aspect and making sure that the plans are submitted within the right deadlines. Perfect. Now, in Table 1 of the reports from the panelists, the revenue for Crown Corporation was 7 billion, whereas the actual was 12.8 billion, so almost the double. So how is it possible to make that type of error with modelling? Is there a pilot in the plane when we're talking about the Crown corporations? So I don't have the variance analysis in front of me, but I can come back with that particular analysis for you. Thank you.
Mr. Desjardins, you have the floor now for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I believe, is this our last round or second last?
I hope I'm hoping to get you in another time.
Okay, excellent. So I just want to return then quickly to a line of questioning I had earlier on the Phoenix pay system and pay administration in the public service. In the financial commentaries again, that there were a comment on the fact that there were 310,000 outstanding pay action requests as of March 31st, 2022, an increase compared to 254,000 of March 31st, 2021. While of course they're the same, of course some of those requests, as the Auditor General mentioned, are straightforward actions. You know, the banking changes, the general inquiries, and those other items. But what I think is important is, if the Auditor General can comment, would be an acceptable number of outstanding pay action requests in light of Phoenix.
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I don't think I would be able to actually estimate what that might look like. as the member mentioned, there was about 310,000 pay action requests at the end of March. Unfortunately, they're not triaged so that we couldn't tell you how many were for monetary impact on someone's pay. So I'm not really sure that I would do justice in trying to estimate what a reasonable amount would be.
Okay, perhaps maybe the member from Treasury could respond.
Sorry. Well, something lower than 310,000 for sure. I would tell you, PSPC handles about 100 to 120,000 pay requests on a monthly basis. The objective is to treat all of these requests 95% of the time within an acceptable, I'll say, time frame. So you're never going to have no backlog, obviously, as the Auditor General mentioned a little bit earlier. But one could see that, something in the neighborhood of rolling, 5% or around there would probably seem reasonable. Like I said, I don't have our colleagues at Public Services would need to weigh in here, so I'm kind of stepping on a limb. But just to give you an idea of the number of requests they receive a month and what they're shooting for as a target is to deal with them in the established timelines 95% of the time.
So, of the
Mr.
amount
Desjardins,
of
I'd like to. I'm going to cut you off because you're basically at
Sure.
the time, but I will get back to you. You'll have one more tour by having me keep everyone on the clock. I'll get back to you again. Turning now to Mr. Cram, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to go back to Mr. Leswick on the topic of debt to GDP ratios. So the Bank of Canada has raised interest rates several times this year. Can you explain what will be the effect of rising interest rates on Canada's debt to GDP ratio?
Thank you for the question. Well, as the interest rate goes higher, we pay more interest on our debt that we turn over. And so what will be the impact on the ratio itself? I mean, it depends at what pace the economy is growing. We expect the public debt charges to GDP ratio to tick up slightly because of the higher interest rate environment.
Okay, but if all of their variables stayed the same, higher interest rates would lead to higher debt to GDP ratio. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. If every other variable in the economy stayed the same, if you have higher interest rates and those interest rates fed through to debt charges, your debt GDP ratio would go up. I mean, there's a lot of constant variables, but yes.
Yes, okay, fair enough. And interest rates are going up in all the G7 countries, is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, so it could very well be the case that in the next few years, Canada's debt to GDP ratio could go up, and the debt to GDP ratios of all G7 countries could go up. So we could continue to have the best debt to GDP ratio in the G7, not because our debt to GDP ratio is getting any better, but because we're all getting worse. Is that a reasonable assessment?
Yes, I mean, there's this expression that you hear is the cleanest dirty shirt in the world of debt GDP ratios because nobody likes public debt. But yeah, you're right. And we publish these in our budgets and fall updates in terms of Canada's G7 and G20 comparison around these types of debt metrics.
Okay, we have the cleanest dirty shirt. I may have to use that line once or twice in the future. So, turning now to page 40 of the summary report, it talks about changing economic conditions and how some changes in some economic conditions can significantly affect our country's deficit. For example, a 1% decrease in GDP growth can lower the budgetary balance by $5 billion. Similar figures for GDP inflation. Can any of the witnesses speak to the importance of changing economic conditions outlined on page 40 and why this is something important for public policymakers to consider?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, for the question. I mean, this is a very generic way just to kind of stress test the financial statements. I mean, obviously, if the economy grows or contracts, that's going to have direct impacts on tax collection and consumption, which feeds through to personal and corporate income taxes and to GST and other excise taxes. as inflation goes up or down, it feeds through to one side of the income statement, whether it be inflation adjusted benefits or a different side of the income statement, whether it be public debt charges, and as you talked about, interest rates feeding through into higher debt charges. So this was just a very generic way to kind of demonstrate that in the public accounts. We do a more comprehensive type of sensitivity analysis in our budget and fall update, but it's the same sort of thing.
Okay, and back on page 35 with the graph with all the other G7 countries, it says that Canada's total government net debt to GDP ratio stood at 33.2%. What would that ratio be if we did not factor in CPP assets?
Again, thank you for the question. And this is what I was trying to touch on before. So on the next page, on page 36, you see the sum total value as a percent of GDP of the assets in the CPP and QPP, which you see in parentheses, about 15.9%, so roughly 16% of GDP. That's the raw magnitude, but it also gets at the kind of gymnastics that we go through with the IMF and other G7 countries to put these debt metrics on an internationally comparable basis, because you always have to be very considerate about what's involved, and this is how we try to at least demonstrate that and be transparent with these types of arithmetic.
Thank you, Mr. Cram. That is your time, but I appreciate it and your understanding. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So continuing on that line of questioning, Mr. Leswick, with the accumulated deficit of $1.1 billion, slightly lower than the projections of 1.28, do you feel the government is on track with deficit reduction?
Thank you for the question. The government released its most recent, fiscal plan in the context of the fall economic statement and how it intends to manage its budgetary balance and debt accumulation over the medium term.
Okay, so turning then to the Treasury Board, looking now at procurement of professional and special services, that's in Volume 3, Section 3. What are the three most common and or costly types of services procured by the federal government to the Treasury Board?
Well, in this year's public accounts, don't remember the exact page, but you would see that architectural and engineering services are number one, standing at about just over 3 billion, 3.6 or something of that nature. Then you have business services, which basically include auditing, financial management services, and you have also in there health care services, and the other one that's also informatics services. So that basically forms your top four spend as part of the $17 billion overall spend on professional and special services.
Okay, so pertaining to the past 5 years, what trends have emerged about the type and cost of the services procured?
So definitely over the last couple of years, with the pandemic, we've seen an increase, and the largest increase is in the health and welfare services. You would understand the reason why, obviously, the pandemic being the main reason. Then you would see an increase in engineering and architectural services and what we call business services. Again, very hard to point out to necessarily trend, and a lot of the healthcare services, obviously we understand the trend and in the last few years, but in a lot of other cases it's based on when and the reason why you need these services, and that will vary. For example, engineering type services and architectural are those types of services that you will require in shipbuilding and a lot of our major real property. We talk about the renovations of the parliamentary precinct, for example. So as we're seeing some of these large projects evolve, the need for these professional services will line up with that.
And what are some examples of, quote, special fees, unquote, in relation to special services?
So some of the examples in there are basically conference fees, hospitality-related fees, and membership fees are examples of that.
Okay, so now looking back earlier on in this, a couple hours ago, we were talking about writing off or forgiving debts. So pertaining to the Financial Administration Act, why did Export Development Canada write off or forgive 193,410,472 in 2021 to 2022?
My understanding is that that write-off is pertaining to a previous loan dating back to the economic crisis. You'll remember there was injection of funding and loans to the automotive industries. This is basically now that. So that's basically the write-off of the last portion of the loan for one of these companies. At least that's my understanding of it.
And can you explain for us the difference between write-offs, forgiveness, remissions, and waivers?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So a write-off is basically those items for which, and I've got the Auditor General looking at me here, write-off are basically the situation where you have active collection and you reached a point where for different reasons, and we have set criteria in what we call our debt write-off regulations, whereby you cannot locate the debtor for there's bankruptcy issues. You will do a write-off. That does not extinguish the debt. It means that if the conditions changed, the collection can be restarted. So we write them off. So we provide the clearer picture in our books of what we deem to be collectible. When you get into the zone of forgiveness and remissions, the difference is that you extinguish the debt. That means that you're no longer able to legally collect any of that debt. And that could be areas where there's an unfair situation happening, compassionate reasons. For example, you have an immigration loan to a family, and for passionate and human reasons, you're going to decide to forgive the debt. So the idea is that you're not just you've exhausted all of your collection, but really you're making a decision that you want to completely extinguish the debt for, like I said, other reasons.
Thank you, and that is your time. Turning now to Mr. McCauley. The floor is yours. You are on mute.
Great, thanks. I think I finally got my mic working properly. Mr. Leswick, just want to get back to the issue of including CPP, QPP assets as part of our debt to GDP ratio. Where are we when you balance or when you take out those assets in comparison to other countries in the G7 and the OECD? And are you aware of any other countries in the G7 that actually include their pension assets, such as CPP, in their debt to GDP ratios?
Yes, thank you for the question. So just to be clear, this math, this methodology, this calculation is entirely an IMF calculation. So this is what the IMF does to put all these countries on a comparable standard, on a comparable basis. Because the reality is that a lot of G7 countries, which this is actually quite shocking, is that they take their social security contributions, like CPP premiums, and put them against general revenues. And so they don't have dedicated asset accounts.
Well, quite often, do they not quite often buy government bonds with those, and municipal bonds and state bonds?
No, they don't fund the accounts whatsoever. They just take the premiums, they throw it against general revenue, and it's like a pay-as-you-go scheme. So in order to recognize that, the IMF takes our CPP and QPP accounts, and I'll footnote this because I don't love it, but they bring in the CPP and QPP.
Because we're not matching we're not listing the actual outstanding liabilities.
Hey, Mr. McCauley, could you let Mr. Leswick just finish his thought there?
But it's a recognition that we don't take the premiums into general revenues. And again, I feel like I'm defending an IMS position, which I've pretty much fought my entire career in trying to reconcile some of this craziness, because it's the same thing in terms of public sector pension schemes, so like employee pensions and benefits for the public sector employees, which you'll see a matter of adjustment in the same table on page 36 as well. But this is what the IMF does to put all these G7 countries on some sort of level of comparability around their debt GDP metrics. So it's my best explanation, but I do principally have the same concerns, but it is a showcase of what their best effort of what the IMF can put in terms of apples to apples.
That's fair. Sticking to pensions, and maybe it's for a Treasury board, but public sector, for the funded public sector pensions, we use a much higher discount rate than the unfunded. Why do we do that? And what would our actual unfunded liability be if we actually use the same discount rate?
So you'll remember a few years back, based on the Auditor General's recommendation and observation, we did indeed, Mr. Chair, change our discounting methodology for the unfunded portion of the pension. Now, the funded portion, the member's absolutely correct. We use what we call the expected rate of return, which is in line with the current public sector standards. So again, that said, there's a lot of work being done by the Public Sector Accounting Board as we speak now, and the International Standard Board on that perspective. And
right.
again,
Can I
we will
interrupt you
readjust.
for just 2 seconds?
Yeah.
Would you both provide us with what the added liability would be if the funded discount rate was as similar to the unfunded? And the reason I ask that, because I remember reading a report, Treasury Board justifying using a higher discount rate because they had a higher rate of return. They have a higher rate of return because they're investing in higher risk assets, and they can invest in higher risk equities and assets because the taxpayers will cover any losses. So it's a very circular logic of we have this because the taxpayers will cover any losses on our investments. So I'm just wondering if we went back to C.D. Howe and others have said to use real returns or bonds like the unfunded, what would the outstanding liability would be? And obviously get back to us because I don't want an answer right now.
And we don't compute what the differences are to bring it back to the same discount rate. What is disclosed in the public accounts on page 85 in the pension plan note is the sensitivity analysis. So an increase of 1% in discount rates on the funded has a impact of $27.9 billion on the liability, and a decrease is 35.
I'm afraid you are out of time, Mr. McCauley.
Okay.
You can speak to Mr.
Thanks
Cram
very
about
much.
splitting time. Turning now to Ms. Bradford again. I don't know if your question to the controller was complete last time, but the floor is yours again, Ms. Bradford, for 5 minutes.
Okay, yes. So good. I'm glad to get back to this. So where was the train of thought here? Oh, I know what I wanted to ask. So you mentioned that when you write something off, it's not necessarily written off forever. If circumstances change, you can go back after that entity again. So in the case of bankruptcy of a corporation or an individual, can you go back after they've come out of bankruptcy, or does bankruptcy absolve it?
And the bankruptcy, you become discharged. I just want to make a little bit of a point here. When I say, when you write something off, like I said, you need to meet certain criteria. Your collection action will basically almost, should I say, stop. So I'll give you an example. On the tax write-offs, which is a few billions every year CRA will receive money from individuals that, although their account has been written off, will still pay their amount due. So there is monies that are still recovered, not through necessarily active collection action in a lot of times. Although if you're in a situation where you cannot locate a debtor and then you have information as to that may allow you to resume collection action, you're entitled to do that in some of these cases.
Okay. And what are the key reasons for which write-offs and forgiveness increased by 75% from the previous fiscal year?
So mainly due to, again, tax receivables and the work that the Canada Revenue Agency is doing. So during the pandemic, I would say there was a certain, I'll say relief, but more flexibility were provided to taxpayers in the times of crisis. And in somewhere in 2021, I would say the more traditional collection actions slowly resume to normal. So that's why we're seeing a little bit of a spike this year compared to previous years, because there was a little bit of a, I don't want to say a break, but there was a little bit of an adjustment as to the collection measures that were being done.
Okay, so now the next questions then are for the Department of Finance. In its commentary, 2021-22 financial audits, the OAG stated that the 2022 federal budget, the government projected that the overall public debt charges will rise to $42.9 billion, making up 8.5% of the government's projected expenses, and by 2026 to 27 fiscal year, compared with 4.9% in the 2021-22 fiscal year. What are the new projections of Finance Canada for public debt charges?
Thank you for the question. So again, our new forecast for public debt charges was outlined in our most recent fall economic statement. So were you just interested in just the nominal value of those debt charges over?
Yes, that would be fine.
Okay, so.
And also the percentage of government expenses.
Okay, indeed. Thank you for the question. The page reference is page number 51 in the fall economic statement if you want to refer to that at some point. But it's in the 21-22 year, which is the year that we're discussing these public accounts, it was $24.5 billion. And so over the forecast horizon, we would project those to increase to $44.8 billion over the, I guess, 7-year horizon. And as a percent of GDP, that would be from 1% of GDP to 1.3% of GDP.
And how dependent are these projections on interest rates? For example, how would an additional 1% increase in interest rates impact these projections?
Thank you for the question. Just give me one moment. I'm just doing. We include a sensitivity analysis in our most recent budget projections, and those are also on page 247 of Budget 2022, if you are interested. And we show how interest rates impact both revenues and expenses. On the revenue side, you're probably wondering, how does that work? I mean, we have a lot of interest-bearing assets on the federal balance sheet, so higher interest rates means higher revenue. But we also
I'm interested. I have to cut you off because
okay.
I do want to, but I appreciate that there might be more rounds of questions on this. So thank you. Maintenant, Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, vous avez la parole.
You now have the floor for 2 minutes 30, Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés. Yes, thank you. I'd like to come back to the last subject, the revenue budgeted for Crown corporations for 2022. So just to clarify, these are figures that come from Section 2 of Volume 1 of the Public Accounts. So they were put at $7 billion for 2022, but the actual revenue was $12.8 billion, so almost the double. So who does this modelling, Mr. Upi?
You want to take that?
Yes, thank you for the question. So regrettably, we at the Department of Finance do these projections. And I mean, what can I say? like a lot of large financial institutions in North America, results for both the 21 and the 22 year far exceeded any sort of projections, and largely it's just a flow through of much higher than expected economic activity and much lower than expected business write-downs of activity. So where we thought we would have to do loan provisions and certain provisions against outstanding credit, those never materialized. And at the same time, Crown financial institutions, credit and underwriting revenues were through the roof. So it's a combination of those factors that led to the result.
Merci pour cette réponse. Thank you for that answer. What are the main sources of revenue for these Crown corporations? Main sources of revenue.
Thank you for the question. And I can come back to you with more precise kind of light items, but for the BDC and the EDC, I mean, it is mostly both just pure credit, so just business activity, and likewise, just a whole lot less provisioning against existing credit. So unwinding loan provisions that were taken in 2020 and early 2021, which just fed through into revenues. For CMHC, it's a little bit more complicated, but I mean, there was a lot of mortgage activity, and so some of their premium underwriting revenues exceeded expectations, and obviously probably some of their provisions were unwound as well. So you see the building blocks of what created the unexpected result.
Bien. Je pense que j'ai fini mon temps. Thank you. I think I finished my time.
For 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to now turn to the Volume 3, the supplementary information found in public accounts in relation to losses of public money and property. I had mentioned this just earlier in my statements today in relation to the importance of social, environmental, and governance information to these audits to, in particular, paint a better picture for Canadians in terms of how risk, in particular, could be measured in relation to climate events. And so I'd like to maybe we'll begin asking my question from the Treasury Board. What examples of losses of public money due to damages or damage related to climate change and extreme weather events are currently contained in the public accounts?
Actually, without going, there are some, sadly, in the areas where we say losses to public property, for example. One of the key ones is in relations to a storm that happened out east not too long ago again. So absolutely, you would see damages to some property, roads, for example, or whatever bridges that are under our jurisdictions, to a lot of our assets in relations to severe climate weather.
And so beyond bridges and roads, is there an amount attached to the total damages?
And so absolutely. So the different departments have to provide that information in relation to that volume 3 that you're talking about. So if you would go into volume 3 pages, I would say 160 and 161 in that area, you would see the listing of departments with the details of some of those losses. And there is a section in there for losses and damages to property, which is probably the section that you would see most of the impact of the climate.
And it's likely that this number is increasing year after year.
Yeah, I can't say that honestly without having an analysis done exactly, and yeah, so one could only yeah.
Is there more robust information that could be collected to advance environmental information in these audits that could paint a clearer picture for Canadians in relation to total losses due to climate change and environmental catastrophe?
That is an excellent question. It's going to have to wait until Tuesday, I'm afraid. Thank you very much. Turning now to Mr. McCauley. Again, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks very much. And I really appreciate all the answers we're receiving today. Mr. Leswick, in response to the questions about the Crown Corps, it seemed to be like lower loan provisions were needed for 2022, led to much higher revenues, profits. Should we be expecting perhaps a reversal of that in the coming year with the expected recession or expected slowdown? And do you think some of these loan provisions were due to, the upcoming expected higher provisions be to the winding down of COVID supports?
Thank you for the question. You know, I mean, you may very well be right. I don't know that we built that into our baseline. It's part of the fall economic statement, just any sort of uptick in provisioning related to enterprise crown corporation activity pending an eventual economic, contraction. But you are right. I mean, that would be certainly be the feed through.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to go to page 80. Actually, I have the page number this time. Page 81 on the unfunded pension benefits. The final line is contributions from the employer mostly was almost 8 billion last year, 3 billion the year before. Why such a huge jump, like 5 billion contribution? The second
Can you
bottom
repeat
paragraph.
the page number, please?
Sure, page 81. The second bottom under unfunded pension benefits. Contributions amount to 8 billion, of which 100 million represents employer contributions. 8 billion represents special employer contributions compared to 66 million. Just curious why such a huge jump. I know there was a change in the health benefits.
The large one is the 7.8 million special employer contribution relates to the public sector pension plan that was subject to the triennial evaluation where there was a deficit found, and that's the catch-up.
Okay, 7.8 billion, not 7.8 million.
Sorry.
How did we end up with such a massive change? Like, that's quite significant. Like, it was 2.9 billion change last year. Now we're up to 6 billion, 5 billion more from last year.
The special payment last year would have related to one of the other pension plans, because there's the forces plans, the RCMP plans, and the PSPP are done on a triennial basis. I'm not sure which one was last year's.
So what special changes led to this one?
I think it's largely because of the changes in interest rates and discount rates and the actuarial funding valuation that's done over time.
Okay. Would you be able to get back to us with, and I appreciate you don't know top of head, but would you be able to get back to us with a more, precise answer on that?
Sure.
Thanks. And just looking at claims against the government, page 73, there's 4.2 billion claims, but nothing accrued. Can I assume these are frivolous claims, or are they just claims that have not matured enough that the government can expect to be paying out, therefore haven't accrued for losses yet?
That's on the contingent liability, 73 you say, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not
4.2 billion not accrued, not specific dollar claims, and the government doesn't have an outcome expected.
Not assuming, but if you say it's in relations to the non-accrued, a lot of these claims, there's a legal risk assessment that is done basically on taking a provision around contingent liabilities. When we are in a zone, say that we think that a particular case, we are likely, more than 70%, that we will have to pay compensation. That's when we start to actually, and we're able to estimate the amount, So the other amount that we're disclosing here is an indication of the potential, I guess, additional liabilities. Or exposure, I should say. Exposures.
So perhaps just not matured enough in the investigation or the process.
Exactly.
Okay. Could some of this just be frivolous ones that we just we're not going to because they're not going to come to any fruition?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
I think I'm out of time. I apologize.
If it's important, he'll come back to it on Tuesday. Turning now to Ms. Shanahan for our last 5-minute round.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I think that the questions and the answers that we've been hearing today are a testament really to the credibility and the transparency of our public accounts process. I just wanted to go back to Mr. Upe about this tension, though, between the rapidly producing the public accounts and their accuracy, because it's my understanding from previous testimony that a certain number of assumptions have to go into building the public accounts. Of course, we want to work with actual numbers as much as possible, but there are a certain number of assumptions. Can you explain further?
Yeah, so a great example of that is the revenue amount. Most of the revenue, 75% or about, are in relations to our tax revenue. So when you take into account the timeline by which people have to file their taxes, so personal taxes April 30th and business related taxes in June. So what we end up doing, because it's such an important amount, is that we're trying to rely as much on actual numbers. So we let the returns come in at CRA up until around the end of May, and then with that information that we have, we actually estimate the accrual portion of the revenues for that year. So again, as we indicated, there's a lot of work that goes into these accrual estimates, especially on the revenue side, and have to be mindful. The Auditor General mentioned at the beginning that it was definitely their largest, financial audit by far, and I would say probably the largest in the country. Again, by far. So again, the audit work is quite considerable to validate and do the check and balances on what is being reported. So again, come back to the fact that we're trying to find ways to become more efficient without losing, obviously, the credibility in the numbers. And again, so that tax number is that revenue number is highly key and highly material. So we have to make sure that our methodologies to come up with the final revenue number is actually solid and sound and checked and so on and so on. So, as I said earlier, we're doing work right now to trying to take a look at the administrative portion of producing, the book themselves, the version of it, to see if we can gain some efficiencies there to actually allow us to maybe gain a week or two in the process.
I see. And can you explain, because we've heard comparisons to the timing of the federal public accounts vis-a-vis provincial, and I think you mentioned earlier something about federal accounts, 2,500 pages. We've all got those 3 volumes. They make great doorstops, by the way, versus a few hundred pages in different provincial public accounts. So what is the difference? Why is it just the number of pages, or is it the amount of estimation that has to be done?
Well, obviously, the number of pages shows you the amount of information that we have to produce and collect, and that takes time. Every department does that. But the different jurisdictions work in different sets of legislative framework also. For example, in our case, like for some provinces, we need to table these in Parliament, right? In some other cases, they release the actual public accounts, not having to formally table. So in a year like last year, had we been in a different legislative framework, we could have still released that information and perhaps before Parliament resumed on November 21st. There's also other practices where some elect to stagger I'll say the tabling. They do say they have 2 volumes, volume 1 and then volume 2 later. So that's all the type of avenues that we're trying to look at, and what it would mean for us to what we would need to do to try and advance these tablings. But again, just a level of complexity. When I talked about revenues in the province, the portion of their tax revenues is probably 35% or about on average of their total revenue. So again, the methodologies they use to come up with their accrual number is probably a lot less sophisticated than ours, where it is extremely material and where we want to make sure that there's no misstatement in an area like
just on that note,
I'm afraid that is the time, Ms.
Ms. Shanahan. To the Auditor General.
Pardon me, Ms. Shanahan.
I'm sorry, Chair, you've given a little bit of extra time to other people. I just want to understand from the Auditor General, what would be the consequences if statements were ever released and there were inaccuracies in them.
We have the same group back on Tuesday. That can be your first question, Ms. Shanahan. I'm going to get cut off here. The moment whips agree to give us more time, I will even be more indulgent than I am with members. Look, just before we do sign off here, there's an issue I'd like to, which I hope we'll come back to next week possibly, and it builds on some comments Mr. Desjardins had at the top about the Phoenix pay system. And it's not just on the pay side that is a challenge for workers over and under payments. I understand as well that there is a legal window that's closing for the government to recoup some of those payments, and I'm curious to know what the total outstanding overpayment has been to date and the risk to the government going forward. But we'll save that for Tuesday. Mr. Lestwick, you had a comment about the $45 billion in debt interest charges, which I think you pegged at either 2027 or 2028. But if I'm not mistaken, we're going to hit that number next year. I could be wrong. I'm going off the top of my mind here. We can save this again for Tuesday. And so when we start talking about 2028 potentially, we don't really know what the interest rates are going to be out there. But the fact is debt interest payments are going up rapidly from $24 billion last year to $35 billion this year to $45 billion, if my memory serves, next year. So we might have a little discussion on that on Tuesday. With that, I will look for agreement to adjourn. Seeing no one opposed, I wish you all a happy Friday and weekend. Thank you very much for all our witnesses today. I appreciate it, and we'll see many of you again on Tuesday.